Have you ever wondered whether your tests, quizzes, or assessments truly measure what your students can do with the language, or are they just looking at what students can memorize or explain about it? Well, in this episode, we're diving into integrated performance assessments, or IPAs. This is an effective way to assess how students are able to use the grammar, vocabulary, and cultural understanding that they're learning throughout your units. Now, an IPA assesses how students engage with the language through the interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational communication modes. So if you've been working towards proficiency-based instruction and looking for assessments that align with those goals, this episode will help you do just that. So, let's jump in. Whether you're planning your first lesson or celebrating your 20th year in the language classroom, I understand exactly where you are. I'm Joshua Cabral, and I'm also a language teacher in my 29th year of teaching. Now, I also have the opportunity to support schools and teachers all across the country who are working towards increasing proficiency and building confidence in their students. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast, with over 200 episodes of practical strategies tested in real classrooms just like yours and mine. So let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to hang out with me here on the podcast, to think about your teaching, to be introspective. It's just one of the many things that I know that you do that makes you an incredible language teacher. So thank you for joining me here on the podcast. So today we're going to be talking about assessment. Assessment comes up a lot. As much as we love teaching in our classrooms and doing all the fun activities and everything, there comes a point where we have to engage in some sort of assessment. Our students need a grade. We have to record that grade. It needs to be given to the student in a report card, whatever that looks like in your school or district. But at some point, we do have to engage in assessment. Now, there is our formative assessment, which are those smaller assessments that happen throughout a unit, whether it's something formalized that students are actually doing or just your observation of what's happening. But then at the end of a unit, we do have some sort of summative assessment typically, and that's what we're going to be looking at, is that summative assessment at the end, which is that end of unit grade that is feedback to students on what they're able to do with all the grammar, vocabulary, and activities that they did throughout the unit and all that cultural understanding as well. So I want to ask, before we jump into IPAs and exactly what they look like, and I'm going to dispel some myths because they're not nearly as complicated as sometimes we think they are. But I just want to ask you, have you ever looked at a student's grade and thought to yourself, they got an A on the vocabulary test, but can they actually communicate with that vocabulary in the target language? Now, many teachers are moving towards proficiency-based instruction, which means that it's moving beyond just the vocabulary test or quiz along the way, and we are looking for ways to make sure that our assessments remain connected to communication. And as we are moving toward our proficiency-based classrooms, sometimes the assessment at the end hasn't totally caught up and it's still a little disconnected. And we also try to sometimes retrofit the existing assessments into our units where we're engaging in proficiency-based activities. So what we want to do is make sure that our assessments at the end don't go back to a legacy approach of tell me the vocabulary, explain the grammar, tell me the verb endings, but providing students with an opportunity to use all of that vocabulary, the grammar, all they learned about the content of the different topics, cultural understandings, giving students that opportunity to use all of that communicatively in authentic situations. That's what we're looking at, and that's what an IPA is. So in this episode, we are going to explore integrated performance assessments, commonly known as IPAs, and why they have become such an important tool for measuring what students can actually do with the language. But throughout the unit, we do continue to give some discrete point quizzes about grammar or about vocabulary as students are learning it for the first time and acquiring that. And keep those in there. Do what works for you. But at the end, once you've done the vocabulary quiz or you've done the grammar quiz, it doesn't have to be on the assessment at the end of the unit. You already have quiz grades. You already have formative assessments on that. So there's really no need to put it on the assessment at the end. But what we want to do is give students an opportunity at the end of the unit to use all of the content that was on those quizzes in communicative ways, and that's what an IPA will do. So we'll get into exactly what an IPA is, why it matters, the 3 modes of communication which show up on the IPA, and then how to create an IPA. And this includes sometimes doing some class activities that prepare students for that summative IPA that comes at the end of the unit, because we also don't want students taking that assessment, that IPA, and they haven't actually engaged in those type of activities throughout the unit, and you're waiting to the end. So we want to make sure that we are preparing students throughout the unit to take that assessment at the end. So when we look at our more legacy or traditional assessments, they tend to fall a little short, I will say, and that is because there's this mismatch between our instructional goals and our assessment practices. That's where I was talking about retrofitting those assessments into our proficiency-based classroom. So some examples of a common assessment type might be vocabulary matching or fill in the blank grammar exercises. Maybe there's some translation you're having students do or isolated sentence creation. Those are the types of things that are really looking at what do students know about the language and not what they're able to do with it. Now, these types of assessments may measure knowledge about the language, but they often provide very limited information about whether or not students are able to communicate with that vocabulary and with that grammar, meaning that they'll understand it in context when they're listening or reading, be able to use it in spontaneous interpersonal communication, or are they able to write using it in a way that they're able to convey their ideas and a message? So that's what we want to do, is move towards students doing that, because traditionally in our more legacy approach, it's very isolated to the grammar and the vocabulary, but not what students are able to actually do with it. And in all of our classes, that's what we want students to do, is actually use the language to communicate. So if our goal is communication, then assessment should provide opportunities for students to communicate and to show and demonstrate that they can communicate using that content from the unit. And this is exactly where integrated performance assessments come in. So what is an IPA, and how is it a little bit of an enhancement or a departure from our traditional way of assessment? Well, an IPA assesses students through the 3 modes of communication, and almost equally, but it depends on your proficiency level. They might not be exactly equal, but they are at least all present, and they depend on each other throughout the assessment. And so you want to make sure that you have an interpretive activity, an interpersonal activity, and a presentational activity. And we'll break those all down to see how they will look when you're doing an actual IPA, but they are integrated. So it's not they do an interpretive activity and then they do a very different interpersonal activity on a different topic and then they write about something else. The reason they're integrated is because whatever students do in the interpretive, whatever they read or listen to, that's going to be the content that they use when they engage in an interpersonal activity in speaking, and then that's going to be what they speak about or write about when they're doing their presentational communication activity. So they're all connected and they are truly integrated, which is why it's called an integrated performance assessment. So all 3 tasks are connected rather than being separate. And students move through the sequence that mirrors real-world communication and engagement with the topic or the content. So they are receiving information, that's the interpretive, and then they are discussing the information, that's the interpersonal, and then they are sharing information, and that would be their presentational, whether writing or speaking. So in the end, this integrated assessment of all of the communication modes assesses what students can do with the language rather than how many grammar rules or vocabulary words they can identify. Now, they need to have an understanding of how to use the grammar and the vocabulary in order to engage in all of these activities. So it's not that we're putting those aside, but if you're doing quizzes throughout the unit on that content, then you don't need to put it on the assessment. But we need to make sure that the IPA really focuses on using that content from throughout the unit and provide students with an opportunity to use it communicatively. So let's look at the three modes and what they can look like in an IPA. So we'll start with the interpretive, which is where we always want to start. And this is where students will engage typically with an authentic resource. It could be something that the teacher created that mimics an authentic resource if you can't find something that would fit perfectly into your unit. But it is some way for students to read or listen interpretively to a resource. This could be an article, this could be a video, an advertisement, a social media post, any kind of audio recording. Regardless of what that is, the goal is for students to comprehend and make meaning of what they are reading and they are listening to. And you want to provide some opportunity for students to actually show their understanding of it, whether it's comprehension questions or they are writing a summary, whatever that might look like in terms of the proficiency level of your class. We want to ensure that students have a solid understanding of the content that they were listening to or reading, because they are going to use that content in the other communication modes on the assessment. So sometimes this would mean that you do the interpretive assessment on one day, then you give feedback on that and have students maybe re-engage if they didn't understand everything, and then on subsequent days you do the other parts of the assessment. But if you are confident that students will understand what they are listening to or what they are reading, and that they can then right away go into the other parts of the assessment, you could do this possibly all in one day. But make sure that you have an understanding that students need to understand and have engaged really well with the interpretive so that they can move on to the other sections. So after the interpretive, we have the interpersonal communication. And this is where students exchange information and ideas in a spontaneous way. So they are not preparing for this. Their preparation really is having done that interpretive. They got some details and they learned some content through that. And that was their preparation, but they're not preparing language as they go into this spontaneous interpersonal speaking. So this could be students having triad conversations with 3 students. It could be 2 students having a conversation together. It could be an interview. It could be a conversation they're having with you, the teacher, if logistically that works out well. It could be some sort of partner discussion, a decision-making task where they have to come to a common understanding or a solution to something. So whatever that is, just make sure that it stays spontaneous, because students have to react to each other in their language. And it's best to have rubrics when you are looking at this, and your rubric may include that students are asking and answering questions and not just answering questions. That'll make sure that it remains a conversation and a back and forth. But whatever prompt you provide, it is based on the content that was in the interpretive activity they had done previously, whether that was listening to something or reading something. And there should be something that they provide at the end, some sort of product. It doesn't mean they're physically producing something, but they have an answer. They came to a common understanding. It's some way of showing that it wasn't just a conversation, but they had to have an endpoint and produce something that was their goal or their objective. And then we have presentational communication. And what students are doing here is they are creating for an audience, whether that is writing or they are doing some form of prepared speaking. But it's one way just for the audience. It's not interpersonal like with the interpersonal activity. So this could involve speaking, writing, some sort of multimedia presentation. But in this process, students are going to synthesize information from the earlier parts of the assessment. Now, the power of the IPA comes from the three modes coming together. So what they are writing about or what they're speaking about is what they had learned in their interpretive part of the IPA, what they listened to, what they read, and then also what came up in their discussion when they were doing the interpersonal speaking. And so give a prompt that has students really synthesize all of that information together. Now, sometimes it's actually a little bit maybe more effective to do the presentational before the interpersonal, where students are able to synthesize their ideas in writing from the interpretive task and then have a conversation about it. So there's no right or wrong in terms of the order. You should always start with the interpretive because that gives students the content to engage with. And then following that, either do the presentational or the interpersonal, and that's going to depend on what the content is and what students are working with. So as I was saying, this could happen all in one class. It can happen over two classes depending on how comfortable you are with students understanding in the interpretive listening or reading that they're doing. But make sure also that this isn't the first time that students are engaging in this type of activity or assessment where they are using the same topic from the interpretive in the other modes. We want to make sure that we are doing this in the classroom. And the more you do this in the classroom with students, the more you will see that it is not overly complicated, it is not a ton of work, and you get really good and confident at creating the prompts for the interpersonal and the presentational so that students are able to draw on the content from the interpretive. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by this possibility of doing an IPA in your classroom, I would suggest that you begin with a really simple sequence in your class to see how it works. Don't make this the high stakes assessment, but choose a unit or theme or an essential question, whatever your unit is. So you have your unit, your theme, and then identify an authentic resource that's involved with it. Whether you actually find one or you create one on your own that mimics what an authentic resource might look like. So you have your authentic resource that's on your theme. You could have a class discussion about it. You could have students do some multiple choice questions or open-ended questions just to make sure that they understand this advertisement or this paragraph or this part of a podcast episode or a news report or a YouTube video. So start with some sort of interpretive task that uses this resource that is on the theme of your unit. So start there. And then after students are comfortable with it, they have the content, then create an interpersonal task that's connected to that resource. Have students get into groups of 2 or 3 and give them a prompt where they are going to talk about what came up in the content of the interpretive that you did. So if it was a YouTube video where they were watching students talk about their school day, or there were people talking about a restaurant that they went to, so then you can ask students, what is the same or different in terms of what your school day looks like? Or if you went to this restaurant, what would you order? Or you can put yourselves into a role play about being a teacher in that school and a student, and what would your conversation be? Or put yourself in a role play of you're together at this restaurant and you're ordering, what would you suggest? Or you're going to get the same thing, but it's on that topic. And then after students do that, give them a presentational task that builds on the 2 previous activities. So if your resource was a 30-second ad about a restaurant, then students spoke about that in their interpersonal task. And then your presentational writing task could ask students to write a review of that restaurant or to send a text to a friend telling them about this new restaurant they went to and what they had there. So you can see this doesn't have to be totally overwhelming, but it gets students used to this idea of an interpretive task where they engage with a document of some sort and you gauge their understanding, and then they have some sort of conversation about it. That's their interpersonal. And then they create with language in a written way or maybe even in a spoken way where they are synthesizing all of the material for their presentational mode. So try these out in your classroom first, get comfortable with it, and make sure that students are comfortable with the process so that when you have them do these IPAs at the end of the unit, that it's not new to them. They understand how to do it, and you are more comfortable creating the prompts and finding the materials that would be the base for the IPA in terms of the authentic resources or creating something on your own. The important thing to keep in mind is that assessment, summative assessment at the end of the unit, should reflect communication and not the individual details about the grammar and vocabulary in the language. And IPAs align naturally with this goal of communication and our proficiency goals, because the three modes work together to provide a much fuller and richer picture of student performance, that they don't just know the vocabulary, but they can engage with it in the different communication modes. They don't just know those verb forms or adjectives, but they can engage with it in the different communication modes. So to do this, make sure start small and focus on meaningful language use in the modes in your classroom as you support students in their moving toward these IPA summative assessments at the end of the unit. So if this episode on IPAs has really sparked your interest and you would like maybe a little bit more support, I would recommend that you take a look at my Quick Win PD course on integrated performance assessments. The link is in the show notes, or you can go to my website, wlclassroom.com/integrated performance assessment. And this is a 30-minute Quick Win PD course, and it's designed to be really simple. It's clear, practical strategies that are ready for tomorrow. So in this course, we go much deeper than what we were doing on this episode, and you will see exactly how to design assessments that measure communication and proficiency rather than isolated grammar and vocabulary. You'll learn how to create connected, interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational tasks using the IPA framework, and then how to use all of your assessments as evidence to guide instruction and support over time. And in these courses, it's an audio course where you can listen anywhere, but then there's a course document with all of the detailed notes with examples at multiple proficiency levels, very detailed, so you can see exactly what it would look like. And then there's a reusable template so you can create IPAs in your classroom. And then you can get a personalized PD certificate for your clock hours. And I will also provide lesson feedback on an IPA that you submit. So you can visit the link in the show notes to learn more and start building those assessments that truly measure communication, or you can go to wlclassroom.com/integrated performance assessments. So as we end out our conversation here on assessment today, just remember that it doesn't need to be a massive project. A successful IPA is about meaningful communication and connected tasks. Follow the framework. Start with the interpretive. What are they listening to? What are they reading? And then use that content for the topic of the interpersonal conversations, and then have students synthesize all of that in some sort of writing or speaking for the presentational mode. So we just want to make sure that we move beyond what students simply just know about the language, the grammar, the vocabulary, cultural insights, and really provide opportunities to use those language elements and skills to authentically communicate. So thank you so much for listening and for all the incredible work you're doing to help your students become confident, real-world communicators. And would you like more ideas to bring proficiency-focused strategies to your teaching? Well, you'll find PD options that I offer for you and your school in the show notes and on my website. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And let's stay connected on social media. You can find me at WL Classroom pretty much everywhere. You'll also find lots of ideas, suggestions, and resources on my website, wlclassroom.com. Now stay curious, keep learning, and continue the great work you do inspiring and supporting your students.